Hello, this is Toby Hemenway, welcoming you to Creating Gaia's Garden, our online course that we're going to be running for the next 5 classes, this and 4 more classes after this, really to help you bring everything that's in the book Gaia's Garden to life, how to create a really abundant landscape that will support you, support wildlife, enhance biodiversity, and even do things like help you save on energy bills, utility bills, and maybe even reduce the amount of money that you need to earn to support yourself. So what I want to do is go through what we're going to cover today and also an overview of what we're going to be covering in this course. So let's start out with today. So we'll do a few minutes, as we're doing right now, looking at the course overview, the lessons that we're going to cover, the goals, a little bit about the homework assignments. And then today, when we're diving into the material, it's going to be the basics of permaculture design. Also look at permaculture's key principles, those guidelines that permaculture has extracted from nature to really teach us how to do things in an ecological and sustainable way. I'm going to go through 4 really important design methods that permaculture uses to create these abundant, resilient ecosystems. And these methods are not 100% unique to permaculture, but there aren't many other people using them other than permaculturists because they help create beneficial relationships between the elements in a design. And then we'll dive into some actual design methods, looking at some intensive production systems, mostly for the small yard. I'm assuming most of the people in this course have urban or suburban yards. Some of you may not even have access to any yard at all. And even those of you who have larger properties, there's no reason not to be doing intensive production in the inner zones around the house and around the main production areas. And we will look at examples of how to do these intensive gardening techniques in what we call Zone 1 and Zone 2, the places that we visit every day or almost every day, and how to get each thing in these Zone 1 and Zone 2 to produce more than just one yield. We call this stacking functions. Nothing in nature only does one thing, and that's what we want to do in permaculture, is everything in our design is going to be producing multiple products, playing multiple roles, and doing a lot of interconnecting and piggybacking off of all the other things in the design. So that's what we're going to cover today. Then next week, we'll look at soil. Because soil really is the key to health, it's the key to good nutrition, and it's the leverage point by which you can make growing your garden so much easier. If you get your soil up in really good shape, the plants basically just explode out of the garden. It's like physics, you can't stop it. So we'll show the basics of soil and soil ecology, what soil is made of, how to build up the organic matter in the soil, and also really importantly, how to build up the minerals in the soil. The minerals are the plant nutrients that really are key for plant health, animal health, and our health. So how to get nutrient-dense foods. And we'll look at some specific techniques for doing all these things, making compost, compost teas, cover crops, all sorts of other soil building methods. So that's lesson number 2. Then lesson number 3, looking at multifunctional plants, plants that have lots of different uses. I've got a whole collection of what I call all-star plants for the home ecosystem. These are plants that no garden should be without, or at least you should have many of them. There are as many as 30 of these plants, and if you just have a few, that's going to be just fine. But these are my favorite all-star plants that do all kinds of jobs, have many roles, are really useful for both humans and for wildlife, and for ecosystem function as well. We'll look at really intensive growing methods with these plants. How do we get really high yields in a small space? We'll also look at designing guilds. These are groups of plants and animals as well that work together, that work as teams, creating plant communities that actually help one another. They support one another. They bring in beneficial insects to help pollinate the various species that are there. They help produce fertility. They're really good team players. And then we'll also look at how to design food forests, these great stacked assemblages of fruit trees and berry bushes and all kinds of vegetables, and it's basically a forest that prepares food for you, but it still behaves just like a natural ecosystem. Then lesson number 4 is how to save energy and how to save money. fixing up the microclimate around your house so that you've got ways of extending the seasons, windbreaks to make it more comfortable, sun traps to help heat up the cold places, just in general make your yard a really comfy place to be. And that has a second benefit in that it will help reduce your energy bills as well. You won't have cold winds blowing on your house, you won't have hot sun baking your house, so you'll be able to save energy bills. We're also going to look at the chance to harvest fuel from your yard, and also how to conserve water and use water very wisely. Then lesson number 5, we'll look at income sources from your yard and how to reduce the need to earn with permaculture. We'll look at a whole set of forms of capital, not just financial capital, not just social capital, but a total of 8 different forms of capital that all can combine to help create a livelihood in which you can rely much less on money. And we'll sum it all up. We'll put all these pieces together, bring these 5 classes together to integrate your landscape so that you can live in a fear-free future that's really full of abundance. So what is permaculture anyway? So here's an industrial egg, and we're showing the ugly underbelly of how one single industrial egg is produced. We've got iron ore, coal mines, oil drilling, long-range fisheries, because chickens tend to be fed ground up fish. We've got steel mills, manufacturing plants, power stations, refineries, chemical plants to make all the pesticides and fertilizers and plastics that are involved. Things are then shipped great distances. We go and harvest a grain crop because chickens also are fed grain. And then it's stored, then it's shipped around some more, then it's pelletized, and then it's sent to the battery chickens who are all unhappy and miserable, and they peck themselves bald because they're really bored and crowded. And then you get an industrial egg out of that that has probably no nutrition, those really pale yolks that shatter whenever you break the egg. So that's the amazing amount of infrastructure that it takes to build an egg using our industrial system. And you compare that to a permaculture egg. I mean, I would just rather hang out in a system that looks like this, where you have a chicken forage system so that you've got all sorts of seed pods and flowers and insects, and even compost coming from other parts of the yard, and much more natural processes where the chickens are being fed to a large extent, not 100%, but to a large extent from their own yard. And yes, we do have some iron, and we're using some coal or electricity to produce the chicken wire and the lumber and things like that. But it's way less infrastructure, and you're far more connected to the earth when you're raising a chicken using a permaculture method and getting something as simple as an egg that I guarantee you is going to have a lot more nutrition and have that bright orange yolk that stands up that we'd love to see. So that's one way of looking at the difference between an industrial product like an egg and a permaculturally produced product like an egg. So I want to talk for a moment about the principles of permaculture. There are anywhere from, well, depending on who you're talking to, there are a dozen or 14 or so, and I'm going to go through a dozen of them here. We'll also have some of these materials uploaded to the course site so that you can actually create a handout with these principles, and each one will have a little explanation of it, give you a little bit more detail. But so these are 6 of the 12 permaculture principles that we observe before we act, that we make are in a design. It's the connections in a design that make the design useful. We want to catch and store any flows of energy and materials that are going by. We want to make sure that everything in the design is serving several jobs. Also, when there's an important function in the design, like water conservation or energy conservation, or really anything, trying to generate food, trying to build soil, we do it multiple ways. Also, we find the leverage points, number 6, so that we can make just little changes and then get large effects by making small changes. Nature's really good at that. Think of a seed, this tiny little thing that you plant and turns into a great big tree. Then the rest of the principles, we start small, just like nature does, with little seeds and things like that, and we get good at a small scale, and then we scale up. I'm going to be talking about the concept of edge, so I won't go into that now. We try to use biological and renewable resources before we go to technological resources. There's a process in nature called succession, which is just the development of any complex system over time, and we try to work with that rather than against it. It's always important to get something back for your effort. And if you're really a good permaculture designer, you can actually let your problems be turned into solutions. And I'll give you later in the course some cool examples of how that works. So I want to go into a couple of permaculture principles. We looked at a couple of these in the webinar, but I'm going to choose one that we got in the webinar and then a couple of others that we didn't do in the webinar. But principle number one is that we observe before we do anything. We try and figure out what is it we're messing with? What's the system we're working with? So here we're observing chickens, and we notice that they have a bunch of really cool behaviors, like they like to scratch, they like to eat bugs, they have really good manure, they like to eat seeds, they like to knock down little seedlings. And so what folks have done is to take all those qualities of chickens and build something called a chicken tractor, where this is a bottomless pen that you put a half dozen or so chickens into, and you set it down where you want a garden bed. The chickens use their natural qualities of liking to scratch and till and eat seeds and dig up weeds and also put out really good manure that's fertilizer. And the chickens then prepare a good garden bed for you, and you can see on the left side of that funky little chicken tractor where the chickens were yesterday. I'm preparing a really nice garden bed that is now full of a little bit of chicken manure, so it's already pre-fertilized, and it's had all the grubs and slugs eaten out of it, and it's had the weed seeds eaten out of it, and a lot of the weeds have been pulled out of it, and the birds have done this for you, so you're growing birds while you're preparing a garden bed. So that's something that we can learn by observation. Really, really key role. And here's some more chicken tractors of just different sorts, a little less funky than the first one. Lots of cool chicken tractor designs out there. But it's simply a bottomless pen that you can move around, that the birds go in for the afternoon. You don't keep them in there all the time. They need protection back in their coop at night. All right, so another permaculture principle is working with edges, that we optimize edge. In other words, like the classic example is this pond here, where a circular pond has the least amount of edge. In other words, the circle is the geometric shape that encloses the maximum amount of space with the least amount of perimeter. You know, that if it were a square or any other shape, it would have more edge. And you can see the pond on the left has very little edge. If you were to run a tape measure around that pond, it's the minimum amount of edge that you could have, the minimum amount of border that you could have in the pond to have that given amount of surface area or water in it. The pond on the right has got all these crenellations and bends and bays and peninsulas and things in it. So it's going to have a lot more planting room. You can fit a lot more plants into it. There's going to be a lot more biodiversity in terms of places for the fish to hang out and for them to to feed and to hide from predators and things like that. Plus, you'll be able to fit more aquatic plants in it as well. So you get So I love this. This is someone who understands the concept of edge. We know that when we're baking brownies, it's the brownies on the edge that everybody loves the most because they're crunchy and crispy. So here's a brownie pan where someone has added a bunch of edge to it. So this edge concept doesn't apply just to ecology, but it applies to baking and many, many other things. We know that where two neighborhoods or two ethnic groups or two slightly different systems adjoin one another, that's an area often of tension or an area of creativity, like when two different music communities come together, you can get a new form of music out of it. So edge is a really important concept in permaculture design. We can play with it a lot just to do the things that we want to do with the idea of edge. And we can use this in garden beds. Here we've got the traditional row crops where there's lots and lots of path. On the upper left drawing, there's 5 rows of plants and 4 rows of paths. So we've got 40 square feet of path in this little 100 square foot garden. So most of the garden is taken up, or 40% of the garden is taken up by path. And that's not what we want to do. We want to have mostly plants growing in the garden. So folks long ago learned that if they pushed some of those rows of plants together and made raised beds, that they could have now in the lower left there, 10 square feet of path, and you still got the same 50 square feet of plants. But then we can actually use a different shape, bend these raised beds into this horseshoe shape that's got a little keyhole shape for a path. And now we only have 6 square feet of path with the same amount of plants. So we're getting a lot more yield by playing with edge. We haven't changed anything other than simply the shape, the pattern of the garden bed. And then here are some of these keyhole beds, just different ways that they can be built. There are lots and lots of different designs for keyhole beds, and we can take them and put a whole bunch of them together to create mandala gardens. So keyhole beds all joined together to create these amazing, meditative, unbelievably productive space. So again, this is just playing with pattern, playing with edge, and that's why that principle in permaculture of optimizing edge is so important. All right, then another permaculture principle is that everything in your design should serve multiple functions. In other words, everything should do more than one job. If you think about how a not very creative landscape designer would work, when they want a tree for foliage, they'll plant, a silver maple or something that'll give you pretty foliage. And then when they want a tree for shade, they'll plant, a walnut or something for shade. And then if they want food, they'll plant an apple tree. And what you can do, of course, is plant one tree that's going to do all that. And not only will a tree do all those functions like, create shade and all those sorts of things, but it'll create habitat for birds, for all sorts of wildlife, insects. It'll also create beautiful fall foliage. Most trees will. It creates leaf litter that helps build up the soil. Its roots are going to break up heavy soil, and it's creating habitat for beneficial fungi. It's creating habitat for thousands of different things. All kinds of organisms are in a symbiotic relationship with this tree. So a tree is not just doing one thing, it's doing tons and tons of things, and everything in nature does exactly that. Everything out in nature has many, many different functions. Okay, so let's look at a practical examples of that is just all the different roles that a water tank can provide. We had a house in Southern Oregon that had a big concrete box next to the house on the south side of the house. That was a 5,000-gallon cistern that we used to catch our water. The house didn't have a well with it. We had an informal agreement with a neighbor to tie into her well, but we also had this 5,000-gallon cistern, and we much preferred using the rainwater. It caught roof water, and that 5,000 gallons would take us through most of the year. But it was this big, ugly concrete box sitting on the south side of the house, and I really didn't like the looks at it. So being a really smart guy, I built a deck on it, but not being that smart a guy, forgot that this was on the south side of the house, and it was going to just bake in the summertime and be really unpleasant after like 9 in the morning. You just couldn't be out there. Fortunately, there were a couple of well-established seedless grapes right nearby, so I built an arbor and trellised the grapes up over the arbor. And now suddenly all these things started to happen. So we had water storage. There was a great grape trellis, which created seasonal shade, because in the summertime there was lots of shade, which would cool the house, manage the microclimate. But in the wintertime, the leaves fell off, and so it would let sunlight into the kitchen window and help warm the house. It, of course, is producing lots of food. That 5,000 gallons of water acted as a reservoir that the fire department could use if there were a fire around. And also, it was our principal social space because it was such a lovely place to hang out. We also had, you can see in that photograph on the far left side of the tank, there's an old-fashioned water pump. If we had a power failure, we could still pump water out of it. So this one ugly old concrete box water tank wound up serving tons and tons of functions for us, and it became really the most pleasant place in the whole house or yard for us to hang out. Plus, we could just pluck grapes from August through November as much as we wanted. So that's what this principle of each element should perform multiple functions. It's what it does for us. All right, so with a quick look at some permaculture principles then, and I'm going to revisit some of these and introduce a few new ones as well throughout the rest of this lesson. I want to go into a few design methods. We covered a couple of them in the webinar, but I want to look at those from a different perspective, and I want to introduce a couple of more as well. So during the webinar, we talked about the idea of zones, using the zone system or zone analysis. And this is simply the idea that when you're putting a design together, whether it's a landscape or designing a house or an office or putting away your groceries, whatever it is, the things that you use the most often should go closest to where you are most of the time. So in other words, we place things by the frequency of use, how often we need to use them, and also how often they need us, like little seedlings that we're getting started. We may not need them that much because they're just little seedlings and aren't doing as much good, but they need us to take care of them every day. One hot afternoon can completely fry a little 6-pack of seedlings. So they need us and they need to be near us. So we place things in different zones depending on how often they need us and how often we need them. So this creates the relationship. The relationship that this creates is between the user and the parts of the design. So let's unpack that a little bit. The zones are never concentric circles like what I just showed here, those concentric circles. Even the drawing in the lower right there is, you won't see zones that look exactly like that either. They're always shaped by topography and access. So if we take a fairly good sized yard like this one, the zones in it are shaped by where the paths are, where the doors are, whether there are slopes and hills and things like that, whether there's stuff in the way, great big trees that we have to go around, or sheds or anything like that. So zone 1 then would be something pretty close to the house. Like here's a house that doesn't have a garage, so we park out on the street and we walk in that front path there down at the bottom. And so we've got some salad greens and things, herbs, things that we use every day. So as we get out of our car or whatever transportation method we use, we walk down that path, we harvest a bunch of salad greens, and by the time we're inside, we've got a lovely salad that's already prepared for us. And it's not like we're suddenly inside and we've kicked off our shoes and we're sitting in our chair and we're, popping in Netflix and we're watching something and we suddenly realize, oh, I should go out to the garden and get some salad. It's like, no, you're not going to do that because you're already comfortable inside. Whereas if you put the salad between your car door and your front door, if that's where your salad garden goes, then you're going to be much more liable to use it. And in the back, the same thing, the plants that you use the most often and the things that you use the most often, like a patio or a little patch of lawn. Then things that don't need quite as much attention, that need a little bit less management, then those things would be in zone 2. So we've got say like production vegetables, something like that. They don't need your attention every single day. The big sauce tomatoes or canning beans or something like that. But you want to keep an eye on them at least a couple times a week to make sure they're doing all right. Those could go in zone 2, a little bit further from the house, but not super far. And then if you got a big enough yard, it could have a zone 3 and maybe even a zone 4. But most people who live in cities and towns with a 50 by 100 foot lot or something like that, they're probably only going to have a zone 1 and a zone 2 in their yard. And I always recommend putting in a little wilderness area as well, a little wild zone that you're just letting go wild so that you can observe it. So zones go from the most managed that are really close to the house and out to the least managed, which would be the wild places that we don't even manage them, wilderness areas and things like that. So just looking at what actually goes in a zone, we'll drop into a little bit more detail here. So I think of zone 1 as the zone of self-reliance. It's where we meet our own needs as much as we can or as much as practical for us. You don't have to grow all your own food, but what does it make sense for you to grow? Well, try that. Foods that's easy to grow in your climate, or food that you really like to eat, or food that might be really expensive to buy in the store. Those would be the things that you would grow in your yard. So in zone 1, then, the functions of zone 1 would be to help prep the microclimate for the house, act as windbreaks and sunshade and just to help cool things or warm things so that you don't have as big a heating or cooling bill, to provide the food that you eat every day, like salad greens, maybe some flowers and things if you're the kind of person who likes a little cut flower arrangement every couple of days. Usually there's a social space in zone 1, and also we often use it for propagating plants because we really need to keep an eye on those little cuttings and seedlings and things like that. Structures that might go in zone 1, we might have a greenhouse, or that could go a little further away, but a trellis or arbor or a deck or patio, social spaces like that, you're probably going to want to use them every day. Or at least hope you can use them every day. So those would go in zone 1. A bird bath, if you're that kind of person, maybe a little bit of storage of some sort, perhaps a potting shed or a tool shed. And if you do a worm bin, you'd want that nice and close so that you can put your compost in it just about every day. So those would be some potential structures. Not all of them have to go there, but that's just a list of a few. Then the things that you might grow there, like I said, salad greens and herbs and flowers and maybe some little dwarf fruit trees, a few bushes, low shrubs, or larger trees that are going to help you manage microclimate for shade or wind or that sort of thing. Then the garden techniques that we use would be very intensive. We're going to do a lot of composting, mulching, soil building, stacking of lots of plants. We may use things like the square foot gardening method or John Jevons bio-intensive methods, a method of growing plants called espalier, where you can flatten things out against a wall, growing like fruit trees that are flattened out and tied to a fence. And also we'll be doing our plant propagating there. And water sources, rain barrels, little ponds, maybe your gray water system, and then the faucets from the house will be the principal water systems in zone 1. And animals for zone 1, a little bit of like chickens and ducks, probably not so much turkeys and emus and bigger things like that, but smaller poultry, maybe rabbits, guinea pigs if you're growing that sort of thing, worm bins, and maybe bees, although some people might want their bees out in zone 2, somewhere where you can keep an eye on them, but they're not like right in your bedroom window. And then zone 2, I think of more of the home production zone, where we're going to be producing perhaps market crops or else just larger scale things like all the things we're going to be making sauces and canning and freezing and all of those. So the functions then would be lots of food production, propagating plants as well, and then habitat. We start to really think about habitat out in zone 2. Zone 1, we may be gardening pretty intensively, and we've got some pretty flowers and things, but a little bit of habitat, but we're really bringing more habitat in by the time we get to zone 2. Then potential structures, maybe a greenhouse, a small barn, workshop might be out there, because these are structures that we will use once or twice or 3 times a week, something like that. Maybe your wood storage would go there. You might have a little wood storage right next to the house and then larger wood storage further out in zone 2. The crops would be, as I said, the staples, small fruit and nut trees. If you're in an area that's fire prone, you'd want fire retardant plants. And this is where you really start to bring in your native plants so that they, we always want native plants growing to provide habitat for all the great native pollinators and native birds we've got around. And garden techniques, then, just things that we do every week. We're not as intense in zone 2 as we are in zone 1. With seasonal pruning and putting in cover crops, things like that. Then water sources, our well might be out there. We might have a larger pond, bigger tanks, also gray water out there, irrigation systems, swales and other water harvesting devices. And then animals could be some of the smaller stuff, rabbits and fish and poultry, but also goats or small livestock like that. And then bees as well could go in zone 2. Okay. So the zone concept is really flexible. And there was a fellow who took one of my courses years ago who lived in the city. He had an apartment in Palo Alto. And he said, I love this zone idea. This is a guy named Bart Anderson who helps run the resilience.org website. And Bart was saying, look, I love this idea of zones, but I don't even have a yard. I have a little balcony. And he applied the idea of zones to urban living and thought of a zone as how he managed to get to a place. So for him, zone 1 was places that he would walk to. Zone 2 would be places that he took a bicycle to. Zone 3 were places that public transport got him to. Zone 4 was places he needed a car to get to. Zone 5 would be things that he needed some sort of other, like a plane or a boat or a train or something like that to get to. All right, but this is just showing that we can apply zones to things other than just landscape design, how we get somewhere we could use zones for. There we go. Or like we can think about how the zones in the kitchen. You know, zone 1 in our kitchen would be the countertops, things that we have out all the time, the blender and cutting board and things that we want handy that we use several times a day. Zone 2 would be the upper drawers and those upper cabinets that are really easy to get to. Zone 3 would be the lower cabinets that you kind of have to bend over to get to. Zone 4 I think of as that really ungainly cabinet up above the fridge that's hard to get to. And so on. So where you have zones in the kitchen, or you could have zones in your office, like at your desk. Zone 1 would be where your laptop is. Zone 2 would be where you keep reference books. So maybe like for me as a writer, I keep reference books behind my computer. So I just reach up and over behind my computer and grab the books that are there. Zone 3 would be files and things that I have to get up to get, and so on. Or you can think of zones as a way of setting up a good food system. Like zone 1 in a setting up a good regional food system. Zone 1 could be your garden. Grow whatever you can from your garden. If you don't have a garden, no big deal. And then zone 2 would be things that come from community supported agriculture or community gardens or school gardens. Then zone 3 would be things that we can buy at farmers markets. And those 3 zones right there will probably take care of a lot of our food needs. But if we can't meet all of our food needs, that's when we go to zone 4, which would be the local grocery stores that support local farms and try to focus on local products, although we'd still get coffee and chocolate and other staples like that from zone 4. And ideally, we would be able to meet all of our food needs from those 4 inner zones. And then zone 5, we'd hardly ever go to, but that would be when you sneak into Costco and hope your friends don't see you doing that. Kind of the wilderness area where we don't visit very often, or only when we really have to, and we try to make very little impact. Another example of zones would be in relationships. Like my wife is definitely right in my zone 1. And then if you've got children at home, they are probably in your zone 1 or maybe zone 2, but probably zone 1. Zone 3 would be really close friends, family that you're very close to, colleagues that you work with a lot. So just the idea that zones can be applied in many, many different ways, not just to landscape, but to organizing really anything that has to do with frequency of use. Anytime you are using something or it needs your attention, or that you're involved with people or materials or anything like that, we can use the whole zone concept to help us figure out where things should go. That's really what this design method does, is it tells us, where does stuff go? Where should we put stuff? All right, so just to sum up then, zones help to create a relationship between the user or the center of use, like you or the designer or your client, and the parts, the things that are in your design. And it tells you where to put things by how often you need them and how often they need you. And just a reminder that in the real world, zones are never concentric circles. They're shaped by topography and access and all the other things that shape them. All right, so that is a look at zones. Then we've got sectors, which is another design method called sector analysis, which is just what are the influences that we can't turn off or on, but that affect our design. Influences that come from off of our site, like the sun or the wind or wildfire or wildlife, or say, where do the cold winter storms come from? Where are floods liable to come from? Those sorts of things. So those are things that we can think of as sectors. And I know in the webinar I talked about sectors a bit. So I'm going to just briefly review them, but then give you a couple of new looks at how we can use sectors. But they are influences from off the site that we can't turn on or turn off. We have to arrange the things in our design in the right relationship with these sectors. So there are lots of different ways to map sectors. They're challenging to do maps of. Sometimes we just make lists of sectors, but here's a design that some students did showing flooding sectors and cold winter winds, and here's a security risk over there in the upper right. Water waste, the overly irrigated grass, loud noises, just showing all the different influences that come either from off the site or that can't really be controlled right on the site. So sectors can be kind of hard to draw, but and sometimes we just list them. Other times you can tell right where they're coming from and how to locate them on the landscape. And as I mentioned last time during the webinar, you really want to get your sectors right. That, you know, if you mess up on a sector, you know, like if there's a snoopy neighbor or a loud barking dog nearby, or pollution coming in, or a really cold, unpleasant wind, then, you know, or zoning violation, something like that, you need to deal with that by placing the elements in your design in the right relationship with them. You know, a windbreak or a privacy screen or a noise barrier, or, you know, get the zoning right. So a nice example of that I mentioned last time, just for quick review, was my friend Mark Lakeman up in Portland, who needed to roof over an outdoor public structure and found that the permit for the roof was going to cost a whole bunch of money. And so he asked, well, what's the largest roof I can build without a permit? And it turns out to be the size of each one of those little sheets of plywood that are there on that roof. And so he just built a whole series of those little tiny roofs and put them all together, thus making the whole zoning issue go away, because he's perfectly legal. But he didn't need to buy an expensive permit because he stayed under the maximum roof size that would trigger the permitting process. So I want to tell a quick little story here about, it could be a long story, but I'll try to make it fairly short, about why doing a good sector analysis is so important. I knew some folks at an intentional community, used to teach there a lot, and there was a guy there who took this was an intentional community in Oregon, and one of the members of the community took a class on how to build a cordwood sauna, and he took this class up in Maine. And here's a cordwood sauna. You can see that it's cordwood that's all stacked up. That's, you know, nice little logs that have been all mortared together with cement. They're really cool structures. And he came back to Oregon and said, we got to build a cordwood sauna. We just got to do this. It's so cool. We've got to have one of these. So he convinced everybody at the community that, you know, cordwood sauna was what they needed, not paying attention to the fact that he'd learned this technique in cold Maine, and brought it back to pretty mild, temperate, wet, foggy, high rainfall Oregon. And what they found was that after they built the sauna, for one thing, they built it in the summertime, and they pointed the door away from the cool summertime breezes, forgetting that that meant that the door pointed towards the cold winter storms. So in the wintertime, you open the door and this cold, wet wind blows into the sauna. Plus the clothes for the sauna were hung right outside the door, so the clothes got soaked with rain blowing onto them. And also this sauna, because it's cement and cordwood, well, two things happened. One was during the wintertime, the wood would get wet, and so it would expand and crack the cement mortar. And then in the summertime, it would dry out and leave big gaps. So the wind would blow in. So they then had to line the whole thing with this big thick layer of plaster in order to block the wind. And that made it even heavier than it was. There's a huge amount of thermal mass in all that mortar and all that plaster and the earthen benches that they built. And so it took hours to heat. It took forever to heat this thing because it weighed like, 10,000 pounds or something. It was an enormously heavy structure. It took hours to heat. They also located it at the edge of a parking lot, not realizing that, of course, this meant cars would be driving in with their headlights sweeping past, naked hippies getting into the sauna. And then there's lots more. Essentially, just they weren't thinking about the privacy sector, the winter wind sector, the fact that they were in Oregon rather than in Maine, all kinds of things like that. So it made the sauna really unpleasant, and no one ever liked to use it because it meant you had to light the fire like 5 hours before your sauna, and no one managed to do that. I need to turn on a light here because it's obviously getting dark, so let me do that for just one moment. I'll be right with you. All right, well, that's not great, but it's a little bit better. Okay. So do a good sector analysis, or you will have problem after problem after problem. Okay, the next design method I want to go through, this is one that we did not cover during the webinar, which is needs and yields analysis, which simply means like, okay, we're going to take the quintessential permaculture animal, which is a chicken, And we'll think of all the things that a chicken needs, like it needs food and water and light and shelter and space and protection from predators. It needs a place to roost. It needs grit. It needs calcium to build strong eggs. It's a social animal, so it needs other chickens. And then it produces all sorts of things. It makes eggs and manure and meat and feathers, and it makes noise. It's greatly entertaining. They like to scratch, all those things I mentioned about the chicken tractor. So the idea is that if you were not a very creative designer, you would buy the chicken food, you would bring it water every day, you would build a shelter for it, you would stand there with a shotgun protecting it from weasels and rats and other varmints, raccoons. You'd grind up calcium rocks every day. And then you'd wind up with too much manure and too many chickens. And one of the things that happens with people who raise chickens is they generally have more chickens than they're allowed by law. Many cities only allow 3 to 4 chickens, and everybody I know who has urban chickens has more than that. And so to keep your neighbors from turning you in, you just give your excess eggs to your neighbors, and then they're your friends, and they won't turn you in. So that's how you make your yield from the chicken, these eggs, meet one of your needs, which is to be allowed to keep extra chickens on your property. And that's the whole idea with needs and yields analysis, is that we do that with all the different parts of our design. How can our chickens connect to our greenhouse? Well, they breathe out carbon dioxide, they produce a little bit of heat, they make manure, they like to scratch and eat bugs and things. You can connect them to the orchard because they'll happily eat bugs out of the orchard. Their manure is good there. And then the orchard and the greenhouse can produce things to make compost. The compost can help provide things for the chickens. So you get all these interconnections where all the needs and yields are connected to one another, and you don't have to do anywhere near as much work because the pieces of the design are all working together. Just a practical example of this is how we can match needs to things that we already have, yields or resources. So if we think about urban areas, what is in relative abundance in cities, things that we have a lot of, where there are lots of people, there are lots of buildings, there's lots of built material, all that stuff sitting out by the curb. There's more money in urban areas than in rural areas usually. There are more jobs, more business, and there's a lot more innovation. There's statistics that show that people become vastly more innovative when they live in cities. So things that are relatively scarce in cities then, not much land, or it's really expensive, not a lot of organic matter, not many raw materials like timber, and time is definitely at a premium. So if we match the two, we got lots of buildings, but we don't have much land, then what we do is use buildings as gardens. And here's this is not Photoshopped, this is an actual apartment complex in Vienna, built by an architect named Hundertwasser, 100 Waters. Hundertwasser is the guy's name, and he's got trees that are growing out of windows, trees on roofs. So he's using these buildings as gardens themselves. So it's a really great way to connect things that are abundant, a yield that we've got, lots of buildings with the need that we have, which is how do we get more green area? How do we get more land? And then just this whole thing of vertical gardening, how do we get more space in cities, growing up walls, growing on up on top of roofs? That's a whole big trend these days, is rooftop gardens. Other ways of using space well in cities then would be container gardening. If we're going to say, look, land is expensive and land is scarce, how does permaculture help us come up with ways around that? Well, container gardens out on little balconies, and it looks like someone's even got some on a fire escape here, which the fire marshal's probably not going to like, but we do what we can. So lots of ways of gardening in containers. We can even do mobile gardens, raised beds that are on wheels, or here's someone in the lower right who's built a greenhouse on a pickup truck. So lots of solutions like that. And we can even go to hanging gardens, little containers that we've got food growing out of. And we can even go to aquaponic systems, which I'm not going to go into detail in this class, but in a couple classes we'll talk more about. Which is just the idea of growing fish at really high density, which we've got here in the lower right, a tank that's full of lots and lots of fish, and the water from the fish that's full of manure goes into these raised gravel beds that you then put plants into, and the fertilized water from the fish is then cleaned up by the plants, and the nitrogen and phosphorus that the fish have produced into the water then go to grow your plants. So it's a really cool little closed system. Then that water is relatively pure and it goes back into the fish pond. So, but we'll talk about that more in a later class. And then, we also asked, who's got land? Where can we find land in cities? Community gardens are one place, school gardens are another place. School gardens are all the rage. There are lots of them being created all over. A number of states are starting to mandate that every school in the state needs to have a school garden by 2020 or some year like that. There are also lots of lands that are available at apartment buildings, offices, churches. Are really starting to get into the gardening scene because their mandate is to serve their community. So a lot of churches are converting their big grassy spaces into green space that we can grow things. Okay, then, so that's 3 design methods. Design method number 4 then is one called highest use, which is what do we do first is really what this says. How do we choose what we should use first in order to preserve as many possible uses of this thing for later? Let me show you what I mean by that, because that probably doesn't make a lot of sense just as I say it. But one example is, all right, what can we do with kitchen scraps? Okay, something that we all generate a fair number of. And most people would say, for first we make a list. Well, composting is the most obvious thing. We can use them as mulch. We can make soup stock out of them. We could save seeds out of them. Sometimes you can take things like onion skins and mushrooms and fibers and make dye or paper out of them. You can put them into a biogas digester and make methane or other forms of fuel. You can put them in a worm bin. You can feed them to various animals, or you can just take it to the landfill. That's last on the list because we don't want to do that. And so what we do is we organize them. How do we preserve as many future uses? If we sort them first, then we can pull out the stuff that has seeds or could be used for dyes or paper, and pull out the stuff that is still good and edible that we can make soup stock out of. And then anything that's left over, we can feed animals. Once we're done cooking the soup stock or making the dye or the paper, those sorts of things, then we can take those things and feed them to animals as well. Then we can take the manure from animals and feed that to a biodigester. Then the product of the biogas digester has generated methane for us that we can use for fuel. And then we take the residue that's left in the digester and feed that to worms. Put that into our worm bin, and then we take the worm compost and put it into compost. So it's kind of the opposite of what you would think, that instead of compost being the first thing that we do with food scraps, it's actually the last thing, because there are all these other uses that come first that preserve future uses for us. So that's the design method of highest use. What do we do first? So as a review of these 4 design methods, then what zones do is it connects the user to the elements in the design, the plants, the animals, the other parts of the design. Sector analysis helps us connect the elements to the outside forces. So we'll put in a windbreak, we'll put in a shade tree, we'll put in a noise barrier, so that those are all elements in our design, and we arrange them in the right relationship with these outside forces. And then we have needs and yields analysis, which connects the elements to each other. How does the greenhouse connect to the pond? Well, we put the pond on the south side, on the sunny side, the sunward sign of the greenhouse, and it'll reflect light into the greenhouse to keep our plants growing longer. And then highest use helps us choose what to do first in time. It helps us arrange the parts of our design or the actions in our design over time. So those are 4 really important design methods that we use a lot in permaculture. Okay, so I want to look at how we use these things specifically then. Just how we do design using these methods. I like to take the zone idea and break it down into even smaller pieces. Like I think of the house as, say, zone 0. It's the interior space, and then a screened porch would be part of zone 1. It's just barely outside. You can put furniture on it and it's protected from the elements. And then a covered deck is a little bit more exposed, but we can still put furniture and lights and things like that on it. Then an open deck would be I would think of it as zone 1C, because it's a little more exposed. Then a side lawn, which is manicured, but we're still moving ourselves gradually further outdoors. And then zone 1E up there at the top center is the first of the food producing beds that we've got, a bunch of keyhole beds. So zone 1 is this gradual transition from fully indoors to just about fully outdoors into a pretty highly managed landscape of zone 1E. And then we've got zone 2, which would be larger food plants and things like that. All right, so just some strategies that we can use to get high yields from spaces. And I'm going to submit this to our resource list so that you'll have a permanent listing of this. I'll get you all a handout of just things that we want to do to make sure that we can get high yields from these small spaces. It really helps if you establish beds permanently, rather than moving them around, because then you can plan from year to year. And because we're harvesting so much from these intensive beds, we definitely need to put in lots of compost and lots of minerals. I'm really understanding the importance of having really high levels of iron and copper and magnesium and calcium and things like that in garden beds. You get so much more nutritious food when you highly mineralize your soil. We learn how to plant in really high densities, how to kind of stack plants together. So we've got layers. And then we want to get one plant in right after another, succession planting, we call it, where as soon as something's harvested, we've already planned ahead and we've got something else to go right in its place. Use perennials whenever we can instead of annuals. I mean, obviously we love tomatoes, we love peppers, we love lettuce, but whenever I can, I try and replace an annual with a perennial, just because then you don't have to plant it every year. It's going to have a better developed root system, so it won't need as much fertilizer or water. And I'm going to talk a little bit about planting in compact patterns and also going vertical using all 3 dimensions and how to use some small plants that give really big yields. So there's this whole list of great perennial vegetables that we can use to replace a lot of the annuals that we've got. There's a really good book called Perennial Vegetables, and there are lots of other really good books on growing perennial vegetables. And there are just lots of advantages to growing perennial vegetables in that they use less water because they're really deeply rooted, they need less fertilizer, and they're just less work because you don't have to till, you don't have to plant them every year, you don't have to start them from seeds, all sorts of things like that. So when we can, I like to use a perennial vegetable instead of an annual wherever possible. And then learning to plant in more compact patterns. If we plant things in a square pattern, you've all seen seed packets say, plant 18 inches apart. And we automatically think that we've got, 6 inches apart. We automatically think, well, then we'll plant things in rows. Each plant will be 6 inches apart. But if in the middle drawing on the left side there, we plant things in a triangle pattern, we're still 6 inches apart, but instead of 18 inches to grow a given amount of plants, now we only need 15 inches to grow the same amount of plants. We can fit things into a smaller space by planting in a triangle pattern instead of a square pattern. Or if we use a wavy line to plant in the bottom left drawing there, now we've got more plants, a larger number of plants in the same space. So the pattern that we choose to plant in really can give us a lot more productivity. And then keyhole beds are another pattern that we can use to get tons and tons of yield out of the garden. All right, and then we want to think in 3 dimensions. We can do trellises, we can do teepees, we can do towers of potatoes, towers of strawberries, towers of lettuces. We can grow vertically, grow up fences. There are all sorts of greens that we can grow in towers. There's lots of things that we can grow vertically that a lot of people don't think of. So we got to remember to be able to go vertical. All right, and then speaking of going vertical, we also can stack things into layers when we do food forests, which is here we have 7 different layers going from tall trees, like say an apple tree or a cherry tree, to lower trees, which might be a dwarf peach tree or a dwarf plum or a dwarf apple, then down to a shrub layer where we've got berry bushes, and then an herbaceous layer, which would be more of our vegetables and things like that. Ground covers, strawberries and edible ground covers. And then 6 would be vines, things like grapes or kiwis or hops or passion fruit, things that will trellis up the larger trees, and then a root layer as well. We've got tubers and all different sorts of things that can grow as a root layer. And of course, we'd probably want to get an 8th layer in there of the fungal layer too, get some good edible mushrooms in there as well. And here we just have some of the different ways that we can put a food forest together. It can be more of kind of a jungle looking thing in the upper left, or it can be pretty highly structured in the lower right, or there's a schematic design showing how you can have a bunch of keyhole beds with a food forest tree backbone running down the center. I mean, just imagine how much stuff you could fit into a garden bed that is set up this way. So huge amounts of food that we can put into very small spaces. All right, so I want to segue now into looking at homework assignment and what we're going to do for next time. I've given you a little bit of an overview of these 4 design methods and a few ways of intensive food growing, which we will hit again in lessons 3 and 4 in even more detail. But what I'm going to want folks to do is to do a little bit of mapping while over the next week between now and the next class. And and I'm not asking for anything fancy at all, just really, really easy little sketches. If you see how I draw, I am not an artist, so I'm not expecting any sort of artwork out of people, just really, really rough maps. But anytime that you make a map is a map is what exists on the site now. So it needs to have a title. It needs to tell which way is either north or which way is the sun. You know, folks who live in the southern hemisphere, often their maps point to the south because they orient that way. So, just choose something that'll get the map oriented for you. Need to talk about what scale it's at if you're using a scale. And you need some sort of a key, like if you're labeling thing or using a color code, what do those mean? And then, like I said, a map needs to show what exists on the site right now, and it needs to have a date on it. When did you make this map? So, here's a typical base map, and again, this is fancy. This is done, with some drafting tools, and so it's going to be much fancier than anything that we need to create for this class, unless you've got map making experience and you want to get more fancy. But this is just a typical yard with a few of the important sectors on it, like the property line and where a slope is, and fences, dead trees, things like that. A high dry space where the afternoon sun is. So it would be putting together something like this. So I've got a couple of assignments for you. One is to make a really quick sketch of your home's floor plan. And again, just a sketch, nothing fancy, just a really rudimentary sketch of the rooms in your house. And then what I want you to do is take a different colored pencil or a pen, and starting with you, like getting up in the morning or something like that, trace your movements through the day. You get up, you go into the bathroom, you come out, you go into the kitchen, go back into your bedroom, you go back into the kitchen, you wander all around. So just take the pencil or pen and trace those movements that you would make during a typical day. You might leave for work. Well, then, when you come home from work, or if you've got a home office, just hold that pen on the map and draw all the things that you do, that you go to during the day. And then take a look. What areas have the most lines in them and the darkest lines? Those are going to be your inner zones in your house, your zone 1 and your zone 2. And so once you've done that, well, here, I'm going to skip ahead. So here again is a fancy drawing of a floor plan. Again, you're not doing anything anywhere near as fancy as this. I just happened to pull up this floor plan off the web. And what you would do is just make a sketch like this. Of getting up and moving over here, and then, say bedroom number 2, you've got a home office, so you spend some time over there, and you hang out in the kitchen, you go over to the sink, into the fridge. So what I want you to do is just make this sketch and then see which areas have the most lines and the darkest lines. Those are going to be your inner zones. And then take a look where the bottlenecks are and the heavy traffic routes and that sort of thing. And where the kind of unnecessarily convoluted routes are. And see if doing this tells you anything about your daily habits and helps you understand, is the layout of your house efficient or is it inefficient? This is an easy way to get familiar with the whole idea of zones, because it'll show you kind of where the zones are in your house. Where do you spend the most time? What are the most heavily trafficked routes? So just make a really quick sketch, not as fancy as this, and then put on it, trace your movements through the day. So that's homework assignment number 1. You don't need to hand that one in. That's just going to be something really quick. And then homework assignment number 2 is to make a sketch of your yard, or if you don't have a yard yourself, if you live in an apartment, then sketch a yard that you know well, or a garden that you know well, your parents' place or a friend's yard, something like that. And then, so just again, a really informal sketch, unless you like making fairly formal maps and things like that. But just draw the yard and what's in it, and then locate and figure out where the zones are. What's use that list that I gave you earlier and again, we'll post that up as well as a handout on zones and describing what goes in the different zones. But just really, it just goes on what do you use every day, what's in your yard that you like to get out to every day. And then that would be zone 1, or almost every day. Then things that you just use a couple times a week, that would be zone 2. And then if you've got a bigger yard, you might even have a zone 3 or a zone 4 or a zone 5 in it. So just label those zones. Make a really rough sketch and then draw outlines of the zones around your yard. And then for extra credit, if you want to, make a list of the sectors. Like, do you know where the winter winds come from, where the noise comes from? Is there a fire hazard? Are there places that are prone to flooding? Is there an ugly view somewhere or a beautiful view that you want to preserve? So there is a quiz section on the page for this course. And just take a photo or make a scan or just some way of getting your homework number 2, the map of your yard or a friend's yard, in some form, a scan or a photo off your phone or anything like that, whatever the easiest way to get a picture loaded up into the quiz section by Tuesday, so that I have a couple days to take a look at it. I'm going to have a lot of these to go over, so give me a break by not submitting it 10 minutes before class on Thursday, and I'll get you as much feedback as I can. But really, I just want to see how we're doing with this idea of zones and maybe even the idea of sectors as well. So here are just a couple of examples of zone maps. Just so that you can see what people have done for zone maps. So you'll have this that you'll be able to review. And you can also just Google the term permaculture zones, and you'll get a bunch of different kinds of zone maps. And there are some zone maps in Gaia's Garden. There are a number in this presentation. So you should be able to get examples of zones as well. And then homework number 3 is just a little bit of reading. Next class is going to be on soils, so take a look at Gaia's Garden Chapter 4 if you've got that book, which I assume most of you do. Read Chapter 4 on soils so that you're up to speed on what we're going to cover in the next class. And also just for a little review, the things that I've talked about today, a lot of them are covered in the first 3 chapters of Gaia's Garden on ecology and design. So if you want to, just take a quick scan of chapters 1 to 3 to kind of refresh your memory as to the things that we covered today. And I believe that is going to be it. Right, so here's the summary. I'll just leave it up here so that you can all see it. So the 4th piece is not a homework that is due. But we're going to be, as I've said, each person is going to be able to do some kind of design project that I will help guide you through, whether it's designing your own yard or a friend's yard or your parents' yard or a school garden, or if you want to do something a little more esoteric, you can design a business or an eco-village or a nonprofit. Just what would be an exciting thing for you to design? And then I will help guide each one of you through that design process of how can we use this course for you to come up with a really great design. So that's what I got for right now. That's going to wrap up this segment here.